Hello and welcome to this episode of Essex by the Sea. I'm Owen Ward, exploring the Essex coast, finding out about the amazing and interesting stories it has to offer. Don't forget, Essex by the Sea is now available on your smart speakers. Just tell it to play the Essex by the Sea podcast. Now, as the country continues to look for greener ways of living, electric vehicles on our streets are becoming more common. However, this is not actually anything new, because over 100 years ago, electric trams were common sights on the roads of Colchester and Southend. I'm in Thorpe Bay for this episode, just east of Southend, and I'm standing in the middle of a road with Richard Delahoy.
Hello, nice to meet you.
First of all, Richard, why are we standing in the middle of Thorpe Hall Avenue?
Well, we're actually standing in the middle of the tracks where the trams ran up and down the boulevards. And the boulevards here, Thorpe Hall Avenue and South Church Boulevard, were two of the greatest planning ideas of Southend Council, developed just before the First World War as wide tree-lined dual carriageway roads with the trams running down the very middle. And actually, really out in the middle of the open countryside at the time. None of the houses around me were built at that stage. And indeed, the railway bridge that we're standing underneath had to be rebuilt to allow the trams to come through.
And this is the same railway bridge that was here at that time, wasn't it?
It is, yes. This bridge opened in 1914 to replace a much smaller one on a narrow lane.
So, take us back then, Richard, if you will. When did trams first appear in Southend, and sort of where did they go around the town?
Right, well, the tramway opened in July 1901, and there were a series of routes. They all started from Southend High Street, just north of the railway bridge at what is now called Central Station. And they ran up the High Street, then one principal route went along the London Road and Leigh Road to Leigh Church to terminate. Another one went down South Church Road as far as what most people call the White Horse Pub, although it was renamed in more recent years. And then a third route went along South Church Road, but then turned right down South Church Avenue to the Kersal, designed to take people to the sea. Well, in fact, the Kersal was still called the Lunar Park in those days. And then there was also a route that went round a circular round Prittlewell, but that proved to be not such a successful one, and that didn't last very long.
Now, of course, that Roots Hall, the football ground, is up there. You would have thought, actually, for football matches today, that would have been an ideal route to keep.
Well, it might have done if Southend could attract reasonable crowds. That's another story. I can't remember the exact dates, but I seem to recall that Southend did start playing football at Roots Hall around the turn of the century, or the early 1900s. Then they moved to the Kersal, to a ground there. Then they moved to what is now Greyhound Park, in the retail park in Sutton Road, and didn't actually go back to Roots Hall till 1955, so long after the trams had finished.
We talked about the sort of central Southend area then. We're in Thorpe Bay, so they came right out here. But as you mentioned, the houses weren't here. So what was the idea of bringing the route right out here?
Well, it's an interesting story. I mean, the tramway, when it first opened, only went as far as the Kersal. The aim was to come along the seafront to Thorpe Bay, but the seafront didn't exist at that point, and they actually had to build the esplanade. So in a series of stages from 1908 to 1912, an esplanade was built eastwards as far as Thorpe Bay Corner, and the tramway was laid alongside it. But then the idea was to create a circular tour, and Southend in those days, of course, was really popular with daytrippers, as it remained for very, very many years. And if you can imagine, you were living perhaps in East London, in a small terraced house, in a grimy street with a lot of air pollution, not much greenery around you. The idea of coming down to the Southend on the train for the day, or maybe even by steamer on the river, and then catching a tram at the Kersal, and they had special open-sided trams, so it was like sitting out in the open almost. A slow ride along the seafront to enjoy the river and the sea to Thorpe Bay, and then turn inland through what were really almost open fields. And that must have been a fantastic trip for someone who was living in fairly poor conditions in those days.
And those boulevard routes, tree-lined, as there are trees here now. I assume these aren't the originals, because obviously this is where the track was.
Well, there are a few trees that have been planted in the middle, but generally the trees you can see here are still the originals, or those that survived the hurricane in 1987, I think. But yes, the trees and the bushes, the shrubs, were all laid alongside at the same time as building the boulevards to create this lovely greenery. and then housing very slowly followed. But the nature of it was that the housing development that was attracted alongside the boulevards were large, low-density houses, so they weren't ever going to attract or develop the number of passengers that you need for a mass transport system like trams. So whereas the Leigh route was really, really busy and very popular, the Thorpe Bay end of the route didn't carry so many people outside of the summer season.
And I guess that very large peak in the summer versus probably lower ridership because visitors weren't coming in the winter must have been quite a challenge to run a service all year round.
Well, it certainly was, and I've been trying to work out some numbers as to how many trams were needed in the winter compared to the number used in the summer, because it was clear they did have a very big peak fleet, and it got up to, in the mid-1920s, there were up to about 60 trams available, and on a really busy day you might find all 60 were in service, but in the middle of winter probably it was only half that number.
And if there were 60 trams running on a route like that, I mean, you literally probably could see the next tram coming if there was one at the stop in front of you.
Well, yeah, I suspect that was the case, and I think the circular tours, because they only picked up at the Kersal, they would then get stuck behind the service tram, so I imagine it was quite a slow ride for them. But to give you an idea of just how popular the trams were, I was looking up some numbers for August Bank Holiday Monday back in 1929. In those days, that was the first Monday of August, not the last Monday. And on that one day in 1929, the trams carried 137,209 passengers. So if there were all 60 running, that was over 2,000 passengers per tram across the day, which is quite a phenomenal achievement.
It is. If they were so popular, how comes we're not being mowed down by a tram now?
A number of reasons. Part of the problem was that Southend grew as a town, grew geographically, but the tramway didn't expand to meet that. Apart from building the boulevards in 1913, 1914, and then a little loop line round Warrior Square in 1921, the system didn't grow at all. But the population growth of Southend was taking place away from the tram lines, in places like Westcliff, areas off Prittlewell Chase, in areas of Southchurch, north of the tramway. And so what happened was private bus operators in the 1920s started to exploit that, and they got a lead over the tramway. Tram never got as far as Shoebury, for instance, despite the huge barracks there, which would have generated lots of passengers. So unfortunately, the tramway fell out of favour. It went out of fashion. The council didn't have a consistent faith in its future, didn't invest in it and didn't expand it. And as a result, instead, they started from the mid-1920s to look to trolley buses, which were still electrically powered. It was like a conventional bus with two poles on the roof that connect to overhead cables. And they saw that was much cheaper, but still could use the electrical infrastructure that the council owned. So in 1925 they enhanced the tram route along Victoria Avenue with extra trolley buses. Then they took the trams off that route altogether and expanded the trolley bus routes. So for instance they went along Fairfax Drive where all the new house building was going along, came up to the London Road at Chiltern Schools, and then later were expanded into Southchurch, up Hampstall Road and North Avenue and places like that.
And I guess with the trolley bus conversion, they were cheaper to run because you haven't got all the track infrastructure. And if that's needing renewal in a large way as it was in Southend, I guess that made logical sense at the time to convert to trolley bus.
Well, it did indeed, and the tramway was becoming worn out by the late 20s, early 30s. They hadn't invested in many new trams. They did buy some second-hand ones, but they were quite difficult to acquire because Southend had chosen an unusual track gauge of only 3 foot 6 inches as opposed to the standard railway 4 foot 8.5, and it meant there weren't many second-hand ones available that could be used in Southend. But yes, trolley buses were much cheaper, and the licensing system for the bus industry that started in 1930 meant that Southend found it easier in some ways to run trolley buses than motor buses, although they did start to develop motor bus routes as well away from the tramway.
Nowadays there's now no trolley buses either. It's very much diesel, petrol buses, possibly hybrid buses, I'm not sure, around Southend now. So we're sort of going full circle back to electric public transport, aren't we, I suppose?
Well, we are. I mean, ironically, Southend did actually trial a battery-powered bus in 1914, and it did run for a short while, but the problems of the First World War and getting parts and some of the other buses were requisitioned by the War Department. So the one battery-powered bus with its charging station at the Kersal eventually stopped running. But now the bus industry is developing electric buses. We've had hybrids, but I think personally the hybrid is proving to be a bit of a dead end. London has got many, but what people are now going for much more is pure battery buses. But there are currently no plans for those in Southend, unfortunately.
In terms of what's actually left in Southend, obviously we've got the boulevards, but I guess a lot of people in Southend would just think, oh, it's a wide road with a bit of grass down the middle. They wouldn't know the historical significance of this stretch of greenery. Is there anything else to see around Southend that's left of the tramway?
There's not much, really. You have to read the history and use your imagination. I mean, the boulevards are by far the most obvious remaining example. And it's a place I love to walk most days, down to the seafront. But there are very odd little signs. Immediately above our heads, for instance, in the railway bridge, you can still see the wire hangers that were used to support the overhead wires. And until a few years ago, you could still see the old Corporation loading pier where the gasworks used to be, which is where coal used to be brought in by barge and taken by tram up to the power station at the depot in London Road. Beyond that, there's really not much now you can find, except that very occasionally bits of track still appear. And we've had roadworks around Victoria Circus and the end of London Road, where the council have been pedestrianising and modernising and beautifying, I suppose you might say, that bit of road. And the contractors have been digging up whole sections of old tram line that were left there in 1942 when the tramway closed. And indeed, a few years ago, some other pieces were found when one of the kiosks was being put in the High Street. And I've got a bit of that tram track in my garage now as a souvenir.
Makes quite a nice doorstop, I'm sure. Because I suspect it's quite heavy, actually, or even just a little bit.
It is. And when I went and looked at it, and the guy said, well, if you want some, take it away. So he rather glossed over the fact of how heavy it was. But I did get about 3 or 4 inches gas cut off the end, which, if I go out and do talks on the trams, I sometimes take with me as a souvenir. When you look at how worn it is, you wonder how they ever stayed on the track in the last few years.
Because that's the thing, in a lot of places, and a lot of places around the country, when the trams stop, they just put a layer of tarmac over and left it. And tram tracks being found all over the place as various roads are dug up, isn't it?
Well, there are, and a number of other towns' tram tracks have been found. Because Southend closed the tramway partly in 1938-39 and then finally in 1942, there was a much greater drive to lift the rails and melt them down for scrap because of the needs in the wartime for scrap metal to be reused. But it's clear that places like London Road at Victoria Circus were just covered over because it was too difficult to lift them. But you can still, very occasionally, if you're lucky, you'll find signs. They did some resurfacing of the seafront between Thorpe Bay Corner and the Halfway House pub 2 or 3 years ago. And that involved them burning the tarmac off the top surface of the road, and underneath were the granite sets where the rails had been. The rails themselves had been lifted, but you can still see the 2 lines in the granite, 3'6" apart, where the rails used to be. But that was only there for a couple of nights, and it was tarmacked over again.
So it is still there for future roadworks when they dig that bit of road up again in the future for it to be re-uncovered, I guess.
Indeed, in 20 or 30 years' time, maybe someone else will go down and photograph them as I did.
There's been talk recently as well about a return to trams to Southend. Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think it's feasible? Do you think it's even practical with how the roads are and the infrastructure around the town are today?
Sadly, much as I would like to see a better public transport system, I don't think there's any hope whatsoever of trams coming back to Southend. The costs of building a tramway are absolutely phenomenal. And if you look at most of the systems that have opened, but particularly the one in Edinburgh, the problems of cost overruns, the time it's taken to do it, the difficulty is you have to dig the streets up, move all the utilities, the gas, water, electric, all the cabling has to be moved somewhere else. That's massively disruptive. I think Southend could do much better by taking a lead and offering bus priority and actually saying we want public transport to have a better place in the road hierarchy, and encourage more people to travel by public transport, because we can't keep on adding more and more cars to the roads. The town centre is completely clogged up as it is. We need a better solution, but sadly I don't think trams will ever come back to Southend.
Richard Delahoy, thank you ever so much for joining me on this episode of Essex by the Sea.
That's quite all right, enjoyed it, thank you.
Don't forget you can find Essex by the Sea on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and also subscribe on your favourite podcast app. An episode drops on the 1st and the 15th of every month. So until next time, thanks very much for listening.